Okay, so in the last lecture, we have seen when a new execution context is created. But what about how exactly that happens? So let's talk about that right now. Let's start by creating a representation of an execution context so that we can have a bit more detail about how it actually works. First off, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, we can associate an execution context with an object, which is what we have here. And this object has three properties. The variable object, which will contain function arguments, inner variable declarations, as well as function declarations. The scope chain, which contains the current variable objects, as well as the variable objects of all its parents. And the this variable, that we have already seen in action in the introductory lecture about objects. Alright, so how is this execution context actually created? Let's start with what we already know. When a function is called, a new execution context is put on top of the execution stack. And this happens in two phases: the creation phase and the execution phase. In the creation phase, we first have the creation of the variable object, and we will talk about that in the next slide. Then the creation of the scope chain, and this is a huge topic for itself, so we'll talk about that in the next lecture. And lastly, the this variable is determined in set. So basically, the properties of the execution context object that we have here on the left side are defined. Then in the execution phase, the code in the function that generated the current execution context is run line by line, and all the variables are defined. If it's a global context, then it's a global code that is executed. So let's now look at the creation of the variable object in the creation phase. So this is what happens in the creation of the variable object. The argument object is created, which contains all the arguments that were passed into the function. The code is scanned for function declarations, and for each function, a property is created in the variable object pointing to that function. This means that all the functions will be stored inside the variable object, even before the code starts executing. And this is very important for you to know. And lastly, the code is scanned for variable declarations, and for each variable, a property is created in the variable object and set to undefined. And these last 2 points is what we commonly call hoisting. Functions and variables are hoisted in JavaScript, which means that they are available before the execution phase actually starts. They are hoisted in a different way though. The difference between functions and variables is that functions are actually already defined before the execution phase starts, while variables are set up to undefined and will only be defined in the execution phase. As you remember from the last slide, the execution phase comes just after the creation phase. Now, hoisting is something that confuses many new JavaScript developers, so it's really important that you understand it right now. That's why we're going to write some code in the next lecture, so that we can see this in practice. So just to recap all of this once again, each execution context has an object which stores a lot of important data that the function will use while it's running. And this happens even before the code is executed. Alright, let's go to the next lecture to see hoisting in practice.